The history of credit goes back to 1950. It's a rather new phenomenon. Okay. The good news is all this credit has fueled massive amounts of growth in the economy. But the bad news is it's come at a cost. And I saw it firsthand. You know, like I said, I did credit collections from about 1991 up to about 2002. It comes at a cost. A lot of people have a lot of credit card debt. And the thing about credit card debt and credit itself, and I'm going to deal mostly with credit cards, you know, in this show, although a lot of this is applicable to things like, you know, credit that you may borrow for mortgage or for a business loan and stuff like that. But credit card debt seems to have the most issues, if I can put it that way. So currently, and I've got a few notes here that I took down before I created the show earlier. 470 billion card transactions happen per year. That's on the Earth, the entire planet. 470 billion credit card transactions per year. But to put that in perspective, there are less stars in the Milky Way than there are credit card transactions in a year. The average American has 2 credit cards, which I think is probably a little bit low. I think this data is a few years old now. I've got at least 3 or 4, I think. So 2 sounds a little bit on the low side. There is currently 820. No, sorry, there's 930 billion in credit card debt in the US right now. And let's just put that in perspective. I don't even know if my calculator will go up that high. What's the population of the US right now? Use a damn phone. It's probably easier than typing it out. I can do it with one hand. What's the population of the United States?
In 2021.
So 331 million. Okay, be quiet. Yeah, this isn't going to work on this calculator. I don't have enough zeros. Anyway, the numbers are astronomical. That is a lot of debt per person. Let's see if I can do it on the Google calculator here. Okay. Come on, calculator, work with me. Yeah, we're talking 28,000 per head. So 1950, we went from a cash-only economy. In some places, there was layaway. That was where you would go to a store. My granddad used to tell me the story. He wanted to go get like a sweater or something like that. You go to the store at Marks and Spencer in the UK, put down a quid, go back the next week when you got your next paycheck, or 2 weeks when your next paycheck came in, put another quid down. And in a few weeks, when you paid it off, whatever, 4 or 5 quid at the time, they would take the sweater home, sort of thing. In 1950, it changed with the Diners Club card. This guy, Frank McNamara, was the guy that invented the first credit card. Apparently, he was at a restaurant and forgot his wallet and saw a need. He was a marketer, as a businessman, and he saw a need for a credit issuing card. So in 1950, Diners Club card was invented. That's probably one of the oldest credit cards. Well, that is the oldest credit card. But he built it around specifically restaurants, hotels, and rental car companies were the first establishments to accept the Diners Club card. In 1958, so 8 years later, the financial institutions caught wind of this because so many of these Diners Clubs cards were getting moved around. They saw an opportunity to make some money. The average interest rate on a credit card, according to the stats that I pulled, says 16%. That seems a little bit low in my estimation. I think the data is probably stopping around 2020. So we're 2023 right now. Inflation's high. Interest rates are higher. The rate of inflation is rather high as well, too. I would estimate the average interest rate on a credit card today is probably into the 20%. 28.8% is very common on retail store cards here in Canada anyway. So if you go to Walmart, Canadian Tire, Best Buy, Home Depot, any of those major big box store chains, I'll get to all these super chats in a second, by the way. Your interest rate is going to be about 28.8%. When you start going into the higher risk loan areas where the bank won't issue the credit to you in a line of credit, stuff like that, 35, 38%. I think the usury cost of borrowing is still just under 60% in Canada, so 59.9%. Payday loan companies start to push into those types of territories. So I don't trust the 16% that I saw here, because even when I was running my debt business, the average consumer that was struggling with credit card debt had quite a few 28.8% interest credit cards. So some of these digits here that I'm looking at seem a little bit low in my experience. 1958, Bank of America. So at that time, this is interesting, 1 in 5 never paid back the credit card balance that they were issued, right? They started with a small target demographic, and I think it was Fresno, California. Then they went to the entire state, and then they went nationwide. But Bank of America lost 9 million. This is in 1958, by the way, issuing these cards, because 1 in 5 people weren't paying them back. Credit cards make money, by the way, usually with an annual fee and a merchant fee for the transaction. Merchant fees are usually a small percentage. Some of the credit cards, like Amex, for example, tend to have the higher merchant fees, 2, 3, 4, 5% maybe. The other credit cards are usually like 1 and change. Again, it all depends, but that's how they're making their money. They're also making most of their money now off of the interest rates. And something that I found interesting, I was one of those guys that when I was running my credit card debt relief business, I would start going down these different rabbit holes, because there was a lobbying effort that I had to do for 2 years on Bill C-55, I think it was called at the time, around 2011. For those of you that are Canadian, Jagmeet Singh was a critic on it, and I sat across the table from him many, many times. Wasn't impressed with any of the politicians that I dealt with. All a bunch of garbage humans, to be truthfully and honest at the end of the day. But I did a lot when it came to infusing myself in the very fabric and the veins of credit issuing practices. They're predatory in my estimation. They would strategically issue credit cards to the youth, because they knew that you give a 21-year-old a credit card versus giving a 61-year-old a credit card. The 21-year-old is probably going to be more irresponsible with it, because we don't love delayed gratification anymore. We like instant gratification. And because the interest rates are so high, they can have that 21-year-old on the hook for the rest of their life paying interest, versus a 61-year-old, which has a much shorter lifespan. So a lot of the marketing strategies that seem to target more of the youth. This is in the 90s and 2000s, and time after that. This isn't what was happening in 1958. They were legitimately just passing out credit cards because they saw it as a good opportunity to increase profit margins. Credit cards were then introduced in Europe, starting in London by Barclays Bank in 1966, but it was marketed as a status symbol to the super rich. So the English have a different approach to credit card debt. So for example, in 2019 in the US, there's $930 billion worth of credit card debt outstanding, but the United Kingdom has less than $100 billion in credit card debt. Granted, it's a smaller country, but proportionately, it doesn't align with the amount of debt that's outstanding. I always found it interesting, how cheap the English were always considered. They were always mocked for being. They used to call them stingy. The Europeans that would come and visit the English or in England, or to immigrate into England, especially if the women started dating the men, they used to mock them and call them stingy and stuff like that, because they wouldn't spend a lot of money. They wouldn't turn on the heat in the house. So So in the United Kingdom, they have a different philosophy when it comes to money. It's considered over there shameful to have debt to some degree, and I think it seems to translate into today's world, because clearly the amount of debt that's outstanding over there is a lot less than what it is in the United States. Getting back to my notes over here. Another thing I found interesting was that studies have shown that so if you have the choice between pulling cash or your debit card out and buying with what's in your bank account, or buying on credit and paying it back in 30 days, you'll spend up to 100% more than paying with cash if you use credit. McDonald's studied this very, very closely, and they determined that 55% more was spent at their restaurants when people were encouraged to use credit cards over cash. So like the psychology of people using credit is insane. MIT did a study that showed there's a massive release in dopamine when buying things with credit versus cash. Interesting that is, eh? Tonight's beverage is it's a bone broth. I'm trying to increase my protein intake, so probably about 15 to 18 grams of protein in the bone broth, but it actually tastes pretty good. It's like a chicken spicy Thai sort of bone broth. You mixing some beef broth in there. It's good stuff. Anyway, so that's a little bit of the history of credit card debt. By the way, China. So the United States has $930 billion worth of debt as of 2019. In 2019, China has $1.23 trillion worth of credit card debt. Russia started issuing credit cards, looks like in the 70s. They're used worldwide. Let's just call it what it is. You know, they're used worldwide. They're a very, very effective tool. Now, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I was one of those guys that would, you know, I would deal with a lobbying effort. I would deal with the creditors. I would deal with the collection agency. I would audit calls. And I also did it on the other side of the spectrum when I was running my credit card debt relief company, because rather than dealing with credit card companies or student loans or car loans or sundry items, they collect on everything in collection agencies. One of the items that was highly contested, or like seriously problematic for the banks at one point, I don't know if it still is today, if they still allow it or not, but they used to have these sundry items. And what this was is that, you know, when you go to an ATM and you put your paycheck in an envelope and you'd put it in the bank, and then you could make a withdrawal for, you know, let's say that check was for $1,000 and you wanted to pull out $200 or $300, you could go and do that. I've never done that before, but that was done a lot by people, except for what they would do is they put empty envelopes into the ATM, and then they would make a withdrawal. So they never actually deposited a check, or they would put in a fake check or an unsigned check, or just a piece of paper sometimes in the envelope, because the envelopes had these little holes. So there was readers in the machine that would try to like pick up that there was something in the envelope. So they try to counter it with that. So there's all this like counter push pull that's done with credit card companies and credit issuers. And at the end of the day, it never really seems to cost them any money, does it? Right? Like, I really hope you guys enjoyed that clip. If you want to watch the full-length podcast, you can find that over here, that clip's from. If you're newer to the channel, make sure you hit subscribe over here, and pin down below in the top comment, you'll find a bunch of useful links to my website, my supplement line, books, and a bunch of other stuff. Have an amazing day. Peace out.